Welcome, and thank you for joining me today. I am Brittnee Savage, the founder of B.AI Group and the creator of the Human-Attuned AI governance discipline, which is codified in the C.A.S.E standard. We're here today because we've reached a critical inflection point within the enterprise. For the past 2 to 3 years, the focus has been solely on buying the tool. In our discussion today, we'll shift that focus entirely to how we must govern the tools in the human environment where the tools live. We are moving beyond purely technical safety to establish psychological safety as a core workforce governance issue. The key message of this briefing is that AI adoption is not software rollout, but it is workforce governance evolution. So please submit any questions that you have in the chat and we will address them during the live Q&A session at the end. We are constantly conflating installation with implementation. We see this everywhere. I have personally been calling it the trap of deploying AI in reverse. Organizations are taking a tools first approach, and we're rushing to select and deploy AI without any foundational structure, without any accountability, and specifically without any readiness conditions. We haven't even gauged our readiness conditions before we rush to deploy the tools. And then we try to tackle on governance after the fact, which that definitely does not work, because when you tack on governance after, it's not considered true governance anymore. It's just compliance. And so this leads to an outcome of eroding systems, where systems go live without readiness conditions or defined ownership. Then adoption adoption stalls, users quickly disengage, and trust erodes. Accountability becomes unclear when outcomes break down. And so the gap between installation and true implementation is where AI governance fundamentally fails. We define true implementations as making conditions psychologically safe, specifically establishing psychological safety from the beginning. Instead, when organizations take this tools first approach, they prioritize user experience over user impact. As the call out quote says on the screen, we cannot prioritize user experience to where it trumps user impact. This combined error, caring more about the tool configuration versus psychological safety and the impact of the human user, is the cumulative consequence. And the root cause is something that creates the very trust gap that KPMG and other recent studies highlights. And it causes AI initiatives to fail before they truly even begin in most organizations. So on the screen, we have data from a couple of different studies. Organizations everywhere are rushing to adopt or implement AI. However, the data is pointing out a real contradiction and calling it the trust gap. And so according to the global study recently done by KPMG and the University of Melbourne, spanning over 48,000 people across 47 countries, trust is really not keeping pace with AI usage and AI implementation within most organizations. While 83% of people would say they trust AI with more proper governance, we're still seeing a massive rise in shadow AI. And the really big yikes statistic, in my opinion, is that 48.8% of workers are hiding their AI use. And even more alarming, 53.4% of C-suite leaders are doing the same thing. So this just points out that there's a massive misperception or perception gap. 90% of leaders think that they've trained their teams, but only 70% of employees would actually agree with that statement, which is entirely crazy to me. Now that we've defined the problem, conflating installation with true implementation, and the consequence of that problem, which is the trust gap, we must ask ourselves, what is the single biggest predictor of whether an employee or an organization will actually cross that gap to sustainably and effectively adopt AI? The answer is proven by research from Aaron Reich and his global consulting firm and their team. And they concluded that the answer was psychological safety. We often treat psychological safety as a nice to have culture value, but their study of close to 2,300 employees proves that it's actually a performance metric. Psychological safety is the single biggest predictor of whether or not an employee will truly adopt AI. And so the core metric from this is for every 1 unit increase in psychological safety, it results in a 29.6% higher odds of AI adoption. Crucially, this safety affects the decision to start and to even embrace adoption, not just how much they use it, not dependent on the frequency or the duration. If people do not feel safe to fail, to ask questions, or to challenge the tool, the bottom line is that they won't even begin the journey. So, psychological safety is a requirement, and it should be. And this is the shift that we have to make. The doctrine change that is necessary to address this crisis that we've just quantified is regarding psychological safety as a normative requirement. For decades, the technical industry has failed to govern the human environment, which leads to increased harm. We know that the existing way is broken, and we also know that we can't keep doing things the way that we've been doing them just for the sake of the fact that we've been doing them that way, especially when the data tells us that it doesn't work. Also, we have to take into account of the increased risk of advanced AI and other advancing technologies. We've reached a critical point where we must correct this failure so that we aren't continuing to maximize or realize some of these more riskier consequences. Historically, psychological safety has been treated as a soft skill, an HR best practice, or really like a cultural aspiration, something to aspire to. But the data shows us on slide 4, it's proof that fundamental prediction is possible when it comes to psychological safety. It is the fundamental predictor of AI success within organizations. Under the C.A.S.E standard for Human-Attuned AI governance, that status changes completely. And we are proud to say that we're the first global governance architecture to make psychological safety not necessarily a cultural best practice, but a governable condition. And so this means that it is a normative compliance requirement, identical in status to how we govern data privacy, accessibility, or financial reporting. And this shift corrects in a historic oversight and establishes the necessary foundations for organizations to safely and effectively engage with AI moving forward. When we first ratified the C.A.S.E standard, we made a strategic bet on the future of the work. And we became the first governance standard to mandate psychological safety as a normative compliance requirement. At the time, it was a bold, some might even call it pioneering move. But today we see that it's a global necessity. And so I'm very glad that we did that. Since our ratification, the world has moved exactly in the direction that we predicted. We're seeing what I call a regulatory pincer closing in from both the East and the West. In the East, we've seen China pass landmark legislation just a few weeks ago that specifically addresses anthropomorphic AI, legally codifying that the psychological impact of human AI interaction must be managed and must be disclosed. While this is focused around adolescence, this is still a massive signal that cognitive and psychological protection is no longer a soft science, quote unquote. It's now a regulatory mandate. In the West, just a few weeks after we published the ratification of our standard, the EU AI Act was officially passed. As the world's most comprehensive AI law to date, it shifts the conversation from just optional ethics to mandatory risk-based compliance. The regulatory gap is closing, and global powers are realizing what we already knew. If the human is not protected, then the system is not safe. We didn't have to wait for the Europe or for EU or China to tell us how to govern. We built the C.A.S.E standard because we saw that it makes sense, that these regulations should already have been in place, but that when they would eventually arrive, our partners and clients would already be in a state of human-attuned readiness. So it's important to understand the nuance that while the EU AI Act and similar regulations tells you what must be done, the C.A.S.E standard provides the how. And we provide these specific governance conditions and auditable evidence needed to actually meet the requirements that are in the EU AI Act and other regulations and best practices. So we effectively equip our partners and clients to implement our framework while ensuring that they remain in compliance with the law and other best regulatory practices around AI adoption and implementation. So now let's take a look at how C.A.S.E and human-attuned AI governance actually does that with the standard. So, how do we make an aspiration an auditable governance condition? The C.A.S.E standard doesn't just ask you to care about psychological safety. It provides the governance infrastructure to make it manageable, auditable, and enforceable. Psychological safety becomes governable when it is assigned, when there are clear owners responsible for its conditions, when it's bounded, so when limits are defined, where safety must be guaranteed. When it's monitored, we track the metrics that define the success. When it's escalated, clear paths exist in the standard and in our processes and workflows to report breakdowns without fear of reprisal. Evidenced. So we generate the necessary documentation to prove compliance and continuous improvement. In short, we transform psychological safety into a set of structured, repeatable, auditable governance actions. Human-attuned AI governance is organizational governance. And what this means is when we talk about governing AI in a human-attuned way, we are not just talking about one tool or even really a single department. We are fully talking about the organization as a whole. AI changes everything it touches. It changes and impacts trust dynamics, the nature of the workload, how decisions are made, how escalations happen, where accountability ultimately resides, and who is responsible ultimately. So that means that the governance also has to change if the technology is changing. If the technology changes the workload or the accountability, the governance must adapt. And this is why human-attuned AI governance requires engagement and alignment across every single function of the enterprise, from leadership in HR to legal, IT, risk, compliance, PMO, and operations. This is a multidisciplinary effort that requires governance is integrated, not isolated. And it's also important that we note that this is more easily obtained when done with a smile. So, to make comprehensive human-attuned AI governance work, we use a clear three-tiered hierarchy, which you see depicted on the screen. The structure is designed to prevent the collapse of governance that happens when organizations fail to define their authority and principles upfront. The foundation of it all is a defined governance architecture. Architecture sits above everything else. It defines the governance authority and principles. It essentially is the rules of the game, how we do things. It dictates how decisions must be made, under what conditions, and with what accountability. The architecture asks not, is this model fair, but is this system safe to act with this human in this moment under this risk when psychological safety is a normative requirement? The step is non-negotiable and it must be established before AI is deployed. Once the foundation is set, we can move on to implementation. Implementation translates the architecture into actual policies, plans, and processes. It is the layer that ensures governance is applied across teams, workflows, and decisions. Crucially, this layer also encompasses execution and control as well as performance. Execution and control are functions of implementation, ensuring that the boundaries and operational systems defined in the architecture are maintained. By keeping this authority underneath of implementation, we prevent technical teams from collapsing governance solely into runtime and operational boundaries because they matter, but it's important that we keep everything aligned to a defined governance architecture that sits at the top. The third layer, which is essential for sustainability, is our continuous operations layer. This is the realm of regular runtime and use post-deployment. It's also where audits and compliance reviews take place under the specified intervals established in the architecture layer. This is the origin of our monitoring and controlling, as well as change management. When audits and regular reviews reveal the need for iteration, continuous operations provides the feedback loop necessary to the architecture, allowing us to refine the processes and flows defined at the top. The circular process ensures that we remain agile and sustainable throughout the post-deployment lifecycle. So, if AI is already shaping work, trust, and decisions and accountability within your organization, you are likely already seeing the trust gap eternally. The next step is not to buy another tool, it's to build the architecture that you need. And so we have clear pathways for you to do that. And here are two on the screen to begin the shift. So number one is request an executive advisory call. So this is where we build the system. We assess your environment, your tier or your risk. Sorry. So number one, request executive advisory. Starts with a fit call, 30 minutes. This is where we build the system. We assess your environment, tier your risks, and begin building your human oversight framework. This is the top-down organizational alignment needed to implement human-attuned AI governance. Step two is the C.A.S.E certification and professional credentialing. And so this is for individuals or team leads who need to build competency immediately. You can enroll in C.A.S.E Foundations today to begin building that foundational governance fluency within your own department. And then just to summarize our key message for today, psychological safety is no longer optional. It is governance infrastructure, and it has to be prioritized as governance infrastructure in order to deploy and successfully sustain AI enablement. Engage with us today to begin establishing your governance architecture aligned with the C.A.S.E standard. If you have any questions, my contact information will be below. Thank you.